gosh, I'm gonna have to cancel this. Maybe it works. Is it working? Okay. Let's see if I can hang this up. Fun times. Okay, we're just batikking some dragon denim jacket. This is on a really cool jacket. It will be in my shop. It's a large, I think. Watching some weird movie. So I've outlined the entire thing. Now we gotta just fill it in.
Wake the dead. Wake the dead. Wake the dead.
With Sean McCann. Greetings and welcome to Wake the Dead. Today we are blessed to have returning guest Jerry Marzinski. And he has brought a friend, Miss Lynn Monet. You listeners are very familiar with Jerry, I'm sure, if you've listened to our past episodes. He is an infinite well of interesting information, and he is gracious enough to bring many of his friends and acquaintances to share their experiences and to share with our listeners the expanded realms of understanding that he has experienced and has glimpsed. And we are very pleased to have you here again, Jerry. Welcome.
Good to be on again. I just kind of wanted to do a little summary here because Lynn is going to come at this from another angle that it dovetails what I've discovered on the front lines. So, I've been working on the front lines for close to 40 years. I've worked in the biggest psychiatric hospital on the planet. I've worked in mental health centers. I've worked in private psychiatric hospitals. I've worked in the psych department of a large state prison with the criminally insane. I spent 10 years working in hospital emergency rooms doing psych crisis. And I now have a private practice working with all kinds of people all over the planet. So, I've seen it all. And the entire time, I've been studying the voices that schizophrenics hear. And the psychiatric mafia insists that these are hallucinations, but they run well-defined, repeatable, predictable patterns. And if they do that, they can't be hallucinations.
Right.
Now, I've spoken about those patterns before, I believe, and we've posted them on my website. So you can go there and see for yourself.
Your website, can you repeat that for the listeners?
It's at jerrymarzinski.com. It's somewhere. Those patterns are somewhere on that website.
Right.
But, what the big pharma and the psychiatric mafia have done is they've kept kicking up this fairy tale they made up about the voices being hallucinations. They've got no studies to back that. They've not done any. They just kind of walked up on the stage with their diplomas and went, "We hereby declare," just like the old Egyptian priests of old, we declare the voices are hallucinations because we said so. They haven't done any studies on it whatsoever. They have no backing for it whatsoever.
And they choose not to do any studies.
And they choose not to do any studies because anybody who did studies on a hallucination would look like a wacko. So they got it pretty well locked up,
Right.
you know. But you know, when I first went to work at the state hospital, I could see that these voices were driving these people to do bad things, you know. And then they would say, "Oh, the voices told me to do it. The voices told me to do it," you know. But when I went to study the voices and they found out, the psychiatrist found out at the state hospital, I was ordered not to. They told me, "You're making these people sicker by asking them about these hallucinations. You're reinforcing the hallucinations." You know, by then I knew that was a bunch of crap. So, you know, they started off with blaming mothers for schizophrenia. You know, that was easy to debunk.
Right.
So they moved it up into genetics. So now the average person, the clinician on the front line, the psychiatrist, can't debunk that because now you need a genetics degree and you need laboratories and all that kind of stuff. So they
Right.
moved it up out of the observable path of the mass of humanity and put it up where only a very small fraction of the population could verify what they were saying.
Right.
And that went on for years.
In so doing, it's also saying it's because we say so, because we're the doctors and we know, like, so again, you just have to agree and comply with the same priests. They just wear white coats instead of the Egyptian garb of old days, you know.
Right. And how's the average psychiatrist or doctor or clinician going to go up and say that you're full of crap? You know,
Yeah,
you
they'd
don't
lose
have
their
a
job.
genetics lab.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'd go after it. And you don't have a genetics lab. You don't have anything to back what they're saying or to counter what they're saying.
Right.
But thank heavens, there are some geneticists that weren't under control of Big Pharma in the universities, and they debunked the genetics thing. You know,
Awesome.
so they blew it out of the water. So then they moved it again. So now it was chemical imbalance theory. You know, it's like, oh yeah, there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's what causes it. When I went to work at the psychiatrist at the big state hospital, the first thing I saw was these psychiatrists were prescribing drugs without any baseline. There was no test to test for what is the baseline of this. You know, what is out of balance? How much is it out of balance? Which of the 23 or so neurotransmitters are out of balance? And what is out of balance mean? I found out later that they have no tests for that. They don't even know what the chemical imbalance of the brain should be. It was completely fabricated. It was totally made up. It was a bunch of crap that they fed to the public.
Right. And the psychiatrists that do the prescribing, they know there is no test and that there's, you know, they understand that it's just imaginary idea, but they still go along with it as if it's truth. I think we did an episode about psychiatrists and the whole phenomenon where we played a clip outside of a psychiatrist's convention, and there was a guy on the street asking them, you know, about the chemical imbalance. Does chemical imbalance exist? They're like, no, we don't know. It's just, you know, and that's what they operate. Yeah, those are the ones that were included.
The other ones, they're brainwashed.
But they still operate as if it's true, and you know, they still comply with the authority.
They have to look like they know what's going on.
Right.
So if they don't know what's going on, they just make something up. You know, that's just like their DSM. Totally made up, totally fabricated.
Yeah.
There's not one solid test to verify any of those diagnoses.
And the Diagnostic Statistics Manual is like the leading edge of what the future of how they think for mental illness. Like, they have the Diagnostic Statistics Manual has stated in the past that pedophilia is just another attracted, like people, homosexual, heterosexual, pedophile it's, you know, it's whatever. It's just how the brain works. And then everybody got mad, and then they were like, okay, wait. And then they erased it out of there again. Because they're trying to push these things with the DSM, and then the doctors follow the DSM. That's like the leading edge.
Well, they follow the DSM because the insurance companies will pay for, you know, these numbers that they put down there. But I've heard that they, you know, they make up these diagnoses, and, and one psychiatrist says it's like a tobacco barn in there. They meet every few years, and the guy comes in, hey, I got a new diagnosis. It's this, and then they all vote on it, and then they vote out the ones that are not, you know, doing so well. You know, and so three-quarters of that group that makes up these diagnoses are in league with Big Pharma. You know, so it's a one big cartel.
Right. Just like government, just like
government.
Everything the past 2 or 3 years of, you know, all the tyranny that we've been dealing with, it's all one big piece that's crushing us. You know, like we are being attacked on all levels by the same cult.
That's it, right. It's the pharmaceutical branch of the deep state.
Right.
You know, so and it all revolves around money. You know, our
money
entire
is the fuel
Western,
which keeps it going.
yeah, the money and the drugs. Our whole mental health system is one drug-fueled merry-go-round. None of those drugs that they've come up with cure anything.
No.
Nothing.
All they do is damage the brain. Right.
That's right. Especially the antipsychotics are some of the most dangerous drugs.
Neuroleptics.
Right. They're some of the most dangerous drugs ever produced and used in medicine. Right. And these neuroleptics, they actually found with long-term use and I've seen this in the state hospital, where they do what they call Thorazine shuffle, where they can no longer walk with a normal gait because their nervous system is so destroyed. And what psychiatry does is when those neurological symptoms start appearing, they don't back down on those things. They will give them cogentin to cover up those symptoms, and it will continue until the person is completely destroyed. Right. These people are unbelievable what they're doing.
And the listeners can think of, like, you've probably seen video of people in mental hospitals and everybody's shaking, like they can't, like, they try to hold a plate or a dish and it's just spilling, and you know, because their bodies are damaged completely, their brains. And like he said, the other drug masks the damage, so the damage is still happening, but it's not visible.
Yeah,
so that when
they can't experience it.
Right. So when that other drug ceases, then the damage is even worse than before.
Right. And psychiatry is aware of that. Now, what they found with you know, was that a lot of these, when they started doing autopsies on these patients who died, these psych patients who died in the psych hospitals, they found that their brains were shrunken and rotted out like walnuts. You know, and they linked that to these antipsychotic drugs. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry jumps up and goes, oh, no, it's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia did that. The schizophrenia.
It's a genetic thing. Like, it would have happened anyway, right? Okay.
Right. It's whatever the schizophrenia is did that. So, you know, some of these researchers...
That way they don't have to pay for all the damage they've done to all the people.
Right, and it's amazing they're not having the Dickens sued out of them by people.
They should, it should.
Yeah. So, you know, they tried to deny that, but some of the more honest researchers started feeding these antipsychotics to monkeys and rats and found that the same thing was happening. It is destroying their brains with long-term use. It destroys and rots out the peripheral nervous system. It does permanent neurological damage. And I've never seen a psychiatrist tell a single patient that, ever. In the 40 years I've been working on the front lines. Right. They'll say, oh, it'll make your vision a little blurry, your speech may be a little slurred, you may have some sexual dysfunction, but don't worry about that, you'll get over it in 2 weeks. You know, no, these drugs are destroying their nervous system.
Right.
And they will not tell them.
That's the MO of pretty much all doctors, you know what I mean? Like, even, you know, if you got a new baby and they, you know, the doctors want to circumcise them, they're just like, oh, it's just a little bit of pain. They don't even feel it. Oh, this or whatever, and they don't give you full, you know, they don't tell you what's actually happening. They're like, oh, they signed the thing that said, oh, it was, you know, we told them what are the possibilities of damage, but really it's all damage. Like the drugs do damage. That's their intent. The same thing with circumcision or whatever else they're trying to do. They're trying to damage us. Like it. If you look at the big cult and you look at the other aspects of it, the other wings of it, or some religions, and like, these are power structures meant to neuter us, to keep us weak and sick, so that we can never rebel. We can never think, maybe I shouldn't follow order. We should, so that way we are just kept slaves, cattle, and that's where they want to put us as humanity. So of course, like, they want these drugs that shrivel up our brains into walnuts. That's an effective tool for them, because then we aren't going to be causing we're not going to be a rabble rouser. We're just going to be in the corner drooling.
Yeah, when you're croaked out of your skull, you're not getting straight. So, the whole Western mental health system is a drug-fueled merry-go-round. It just goes round and round and round. What happens is they bring these psychotic or mentally ill people into the hospital. They keep them until their insurance runs out. They fill them full of
guess I'm
drugs.
done with
They give them
that.
2 weeks worth and send them on their way to an outpatient, psychiatrist somewhere.
And I did
They get
this
sick
one
from the side
sleeve.
effects because the side effects are awful. And then they eventually
And
quit.
this
They get
is,
psychotic again.
what
They
is
come
this?
back in. They go back up again.
This
And it
size
just goes
large.
round and round and round. Each time they're extracting, $7,000 to $10,000
Really
from
nice
the
material.
insurance system.
This will
to
go
keep
into
this
black
thing
dye.
going. Nobody's being cured.
And then we
Nobody's
have
being fixed.
this
Those
pink
drugs
one.
aren't doing anything.
And I've drawn
And
out, I don't know if you can see it, but I've drawn out dragon here.
System here.
This pink dragon. It's going to be really
46,000
cool.
Americans killed themselves. 46,000. That's almost as many who died in Vietnam
In 1 year.
in 1 year. And most of them are on some kind of psychiatric drug. From 1999 to 2019, the suicide rate increased 33%. And this is with our whole society being awashed in psychiatric drugs, psychiatrists all over the place, mental health people, hospitals pumping people full of these drugs. Between schizophrenics, suicide at a rate of 3 to 5 times above the general population. But what?
Alright. Let's do this.
Wendy, I'm home.
Welcome back to Raised by Giants live discussion. Thanks for joining in on this lovely day, Inauguration Day, the 60th inauguration of the President of the United States, the 47th President, but the 60th inauguration. Good to see everyone in the chat, any moderators and or channel members out there. And to anyone that's listening to the replay, thanks for joining us. And if you're listening on audio only, because the show is also a podcast, so be sure to follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, iHeartRadio, and Google Podcasts, and you can download the audio-only episodes on whatever podcast platform you listen to. The show drops on all of those platforms almost immediately after it's released here. Also, we are a viewer-supported show. We don't have any sponsorships, no advertising, no affiliate programs. It's just me. So if you'd like to help support the show, PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description. Also, you can send in super chats and super stickers if you would like a question or a comment to be highlighted during the show. Channel memberships are also available and are a great way to help support the show monthly. And when you become a channel member, you get access to bonus episodes for being a channel
Okay,
member.
dude, what
And
is
there's a
this?
huge
I'm just listening to random shit. Let's see.
Bohemian Rhapsody first time around. 7-inch single, saved up my pocket money, and went and got a copy of that. And that turned me on to pop music, basically. So I grew up in the 80s, the first part of the 80s, just listening to whatever was in the charts and whatever was on the radio. And then I kind of fine-tuned my tastes a bit in the mid-80s and got into black music. So I got into soul, funk, early hip-hop, early house music. And that set me on a path to wanting to become a DJ, because I wanted to communicate my love for this music to other people, which is the main reason why anyone becomes a DJ. And I achieved that. I got into radio first off, and then off the back of the radio, I got into doing clubs. And I worked really hard. I always had a very strong work ethic and hustled a lot, did a lot of networking and hobnobbing with all the right people, not P. Diddy, thankfully, all the other right people. And I managed to get gigs all over the UK and then internationally. So it really became a career for me. It was a full-time job. I was loving it. I
The
was
work
playing
really fast,
R&B,
and the
hip-hop,
wax is
reggae,
super
dancehall,
hot.
traveling all around the world.
Has to be
meeting some
really
great
hot to
people,
get through
you
denim, I
know, great
noticed.
clubs,
So
men, women, and life was great. And it took me until around about 2007 to start to see some of the cracks in the music industry facade. So around about that time, I started reading the books of David Icke, and my dad actually put me on to them because he was reading that stuff himself, and he recommended that I should approach it with an open mind. And at that point, like most people in the UK, I thought David Icke had lost his mind, because that's the way we've been conditioned to think of him through the mainstream media. So I was like, really? This guy's crazy, isn't he? And my dad said, well, you know, read the books, and at the end of it, see if he sounds so crazy. So I did that, and I read his book about the 9/11 attacks, Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center disaster, and it raised a whole load of questions in my mind. And I was like, yeah, actually, he's got a point. This stuff doesn't add up. And then I read his book, The Biggest Secret, which totally blew my mind. And I emerged from that process seeing the world in a different way to what had previously been the case. Also, in 2008, I got put onto the first Zeitgeist movie.
Me too. I saw that as well. That's what basically what people say awoken me as well as the first Zeitgeist movie.
Yeah. So the combination of David Icke and Zeitgeist was enough for me to totally change my entire worldview. And I did it step by step, stage by stage. But first off, I was like, well, hang on a minute, because if organised society is controlled by secret society networks, and they use it for mass mind control and social engineering and to keep people in line to enslave humanity, then they're not going to have let something like the music industry slip through the net, given the wonderful opportunities that institution offers to mass mind control large numbers of people. So I thought, well, you know, this stuff must be present in music. So I made that my specialist area of interest. I saw a lot of people doing geopolitical analysis, a lot of people were looking at banking, financial scams, and things of that nature, but I didn't see too many researchers looking into the music industry and the way entertainment has been weaponized through occult symbolism, through the manipulation of sound frequencies, through subliminal images placed into movies and things of that nature. You know all about that. And so I made it my specialist area of interest. And so for the past 15 years or so, it's been pretty much my full-time job. I started to wind up DJing shortly after that because, for one thing, the music was changing for the worst, and so-called hip-hop was becoming nothing of the sort. It bore no resemblance to what had been there before. So I didn't really have much interest in continuing to play the music. And also, in all good conscience, I just decided I couldn't really be a part of this beast machine that's pushing all this harmful stuff. So I started to reel in the DJing, and I had the idea of putting out a book based on the first 5 years worth of my findings, and that ended up being Musical Truth Volume 1, which came out in early 2016. And it's been my full-time job since then. So I've been putting out a bunch of books, I do podcasts, videos, I do live talks, conferences, presentations, and it's very different to what I was doing before, but at the same time there are lots of parallels. But what I'm doing now is a lot more satisfying fulfilling, and probably better for the soul.
When it comes to hip hop and rap, though, too, I've gotten into an argument with some people over Tupac because I 100% believe Tupac was an actor.
Yeah.
Have you looked into Tupac at all?
I have, and I would go along with that. I mean, Tupac was literally an actor. He was trained in the performing arts, so before he became a rapper, he was down with this thug life stuff in the gym. He studied dancing, ballet dancing, and acting in performing arts schools, and he had some film roles. He was in Juice, that was like his big movie breakthrough in 1991.
It's totally
He was
dripping.
in Poetic Justice with Janet Jackson. Did a whole bunch of movies. So it's almost like his hip-hop career was kind of an afterthought to this other stuff that he was doing. But I never really bought this idea of him as this tough kind of thug guy pushing this criminal lifestyle. It just never rang true with me. It always smacked more of it being an agenda. So when it comes to his reported assassination in September 1996, I know there are some people who will claim that that was a staged event, it was a fake death, and he may well still be alive, and I can't rule that out. But the way I see it was that event was used to escalate the so-called East Coast, West Coast beef within hip-hop, which occurred in the mid-90s. And this involved Puff Daddy, Sean Combs, known these days as P. Diddy. So even back in the 90s, he was up to his treacherous, scrawny, untrustworthy neck in controversy. And Bad Boy Records, the label that he had in New York, and he put out artists like Notorious B.I.G. and a whole bunch of other rappers and R&B singers through that label. And then over on the West Coast in LA, you had Death Row Records, headed up by Suge Knight, with Tupac as one of the prominent rappers on that label. And the East Coast, West Coast psyop was all about whipping up discontent and fomenting discord between the two different coasts and inviting rap fans to pick a side. So who you down with? You down with Suge Knight and Death Row, or you down with Puffy and Bad Boy Records? And there was a high body count which emerged out of that whole thing. Not least the notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, who was assassinated, gunned down in a hail of bullets, almost 6 months to the day after we were told Tupac was shot. This was in March of 97. All kinds of questions about that. One that I've got is, why did Puffy, if he was his best mate and his mentor, his handler, not travel in the same car? Quite lucky for Puffy that he travelled separately. So Biggie died in that, and also a whole bunch of other people died in this so-called beef because, characters were getting involved in the turmoil that had no real interest in it, but because of the discord that had been systematically whipped up, people were getting shot. So I see the whole thing as having been a psyop, and given that Tupac's reported death pretty much kicked off the escalations, I have to ask myself whether he could indeed have been an actor and whether that assassination event was genuine or whether it was faked and staged. Wouldn't be the first time we've seen it, nor the last.
Yeah, I think that if you want to learn more about Tupac, all you got to do is watch that high school interview of him. Just type into YouTube high school interview of Tupac, and you'll see exactly what's going on. Now, how far back does the influence from the intelligence and the military go in the music industry? Did it come from the very inception? Because I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is true, you could probably tell me if this is true, but that Elvis was in some kind of witness protection program.
Right. Well, I would say that the military intelligence infiltration of music goes all the way back to the very start. And my research takes me back to about 1955. So I go back to the mid-50s, and that was the birth of the rock and roll era. And Elvis Presley was the first rock and roll superstar. So 1 year before Elvis broke through, you had Bill Haley and his Comets with this very important record, Rock Around the Clock, which pretty much changed youth culture at the time. It used to be Bill Haley and the Comets, but these days it's his Comets. That's the Mandela effect for you. But this group was, they were knocking on a bit. Bill Haley was no youngster, And he'd been involved with bluegrass and country music and stuff of this nature. And then suddenly in 1954, he put out a record called Shake, Rattle and Roll. And the following year, he broke through with Rock Around the Clock. And there was a movie titled Rock Around the Clock that came out at the same time. Also, the song was featured on the soundtrack to The Blackbird Jungle, which was another really important film from the mid-50s. This was the same year that James Dean had his film Rebel Without a Cause. So these very influential movies were happening at the same time as music was changing. So up to that point in the mid-50s, the music scene in both Britain and America was pretty austere and conservative and rather boring. So it was post-war era. It was very traditional musical values. And then in the middle of that decade, you get effectively the birth of sex, drugs and rock and roll. You get the birth of the term teenager, which had not been used up to that point to describe young people. And you've got James Dean, this iconic film god. And then the following year, with Bill Haley and the Comets having paved the way for him, Elvis Presley breaks through with Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, Blue Suede Shoes. And he's this very sexually attractive to women, young, dynamic guy. And he's like nothing anyone's ever seen before. He's handled by a guy named Colonel Tom Parker, or he's referred to as Colonel anyway. He wasn't a real military colonel, he was a Dutchman. And there are lots of dubious gaps in his official biography to explain where he came from. So he arrived in America, and he was reportedly embroiled in an undercover operation which was known as Operation Top Hat. And this involved the testing of biological and chemical warfare, decontamination methods, we're told, and it was military personnel that were used as the human guinea pigs, as it so often is. So this biological weaponry was being tested out on the military guys themselves, and it seems that Colonel Tom Parker was one of these. During the military service that he did in the United States, he underwent a period of isolation, solitary confinement. And even his official biography acknowledges that when he came out of solitary confinement, it had given him a severe form of psychosis. You don't say. I mean, this is one of the standard methods used in MK-Ultra trauma-based mind control. You know, sensory deprivation and solitary confinement, effectively. It's known that this can cause the mind to dissociate from reality and shatter into these different compartments. So this is the guy who, when he came out of the military, was given the role of being Elvis Presley's first manager, and he stayed with him pretty much throughout his career. What we often find is that handlers have undergone mind control themselves, and then they pass it on to their subjects. So there's evidence to suggest that Elvis was mind controlled himself in the early days. This is what they do with performers of all kinds, not just singers, but all kinds of musicians and Hollywood actors, anyone that's in the public spotlight. They mind control them to make sure they stay on script and make sure they keep pushing the agendas that have been set out for them. So later in his career, it seems that Elvis developed an interest in law enforcement. So supposedly he was very patriotic and had quite traditional Christian conservative values. And he was concerned at the moral decline of American society, not least the influx of drugs coming through organized crime networks. And so the story goes that he volunteered to President Richard Nixon to become a spy, effectively. And he said, look, I've got the perfect cover. I'm this well-recognized musician that gets booked to go and perform all over the place. This puts me in an ideal position to infiltrate certain groups and gather certain information without suspicion falling on me, because I'm this famous music guy, right? And supposedly that's what Elvis embarked on. He was working for the Drug Enforcement Agency because he wanted to try and stop the influx of street drugs. He also had connections with the FBI, and he had connections with the police departments of various cities around North America. And I was watching a webinar a couple of months ago, actually, by a researcher named Lady Damagar online on conspiracies.com. Do you know him?
No, I don't.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. He's a Danish guy. He lives in Bali these days, but for the past 30 years or so, he's specialised in investigating political assassinations and psyops and the cover-ups that follow in their wake. And he's done a bit of work looking into Elvis. And his conclusion in this webinar that he put out the other week was that Elvis ended up infiltrating crime gangs, including Sam Giancarlo coming out of Chicago, and also the Gambino crime family coming out of New Orleans. And so he was basically ratting on them, going back to his paymasters in the intel community and reporting on what he'd overheard and what he'd seen. And supposedly the mob got wind of the fact that there was some sort of mole within their operation. And according to Ule, initially suspicion fell on Frank Sinatra, because Frank Sinatra was all tied up with the mob, you know, and they put a hit out on him. And due to some crossed wires and wrongful communication, Frank Sinatra's mother ended up getting taken out instead of him. So they supposedly got some information that Frank was due to be on this private jet that he travelled around in. But actually his mother had got on this private Learjet and it crashed into a mountain in January of 1977 and killed him. Anyway, later in 1977, 16th of August, we're told, Elvis dies at the age of 42 in the bathroom of his place, Graceland's. There are conflicting stories about exactly what happened. His girlfriend at the time said that he collapsed in the bathroom. She found him unconscious in the bathroom. And this close friend and associate that was also in Graceland's at the time, part of the Memphis Mafia that Elvis used to roll with, claimed that Elvis was on the bed when he was found. So they don't seem to get their stories straight. And there are all kinds of inconsistencies when it comes to the funeral as well, because it was an open casket, and the mourners at the funeral said that the body in the casket appeared to be sweating, perspiring, and it had like a false glued-on sideboard that was coming off, it was peeling off, and also there was hair dye that was kind of leaking into the sweat, like this black hair dye, and it just didn't look like Elvis. And supposedly there was a sighting of somebody that looked like Elvis hiding out in the pool house at Graceland's when this reporter was taking photographs a few days afterwards. And so Ule Damagar's conclusion is that Elvis's death was faked, and he achieved this with the assistance of his associates in the military intelligence community, because you can't fake your death otherwise. You just can't get away with it. You've got to have the complicity and the cooperation of these alphabet agencies. And so he went into deep cover, like a witness protection program, changed his name, moved away. There is a preacher who goes by the name of Pastor Bob Joyce, who people might have heard of. So you can get
This
videos
is
of this
him
guy.
right here. Yeah.
There you go. There he is. So some people feel that this could well be Elvis Presley having reinvented himself as this pastor from this small church in Arkansas. So a couple of problems here are that Elvis was quite a tall guy. And when you look at videos of Pastor Bob Joyce, he appears to be quite a bit shorter than Elvis. Also, Elvis was born in January 1995, so he just passed his 90th birthday. And this guy, Pastor Bob, was 1990 to me. Having said that, there are all kinds of things that can be achieved through Hollywood-style makeup and film props and things of that nature. And when you've got the intel communities on your side, and they're helping you to cover up your true identity, then anything is possible. So this guy in his church sermons sings Elvis songs, and it's been commented on.
Almost identically like Elvis too. He sounds like Elvis.
Right. And people have said that he laughs in the same way as well. Elvis had this very distinctive laugh. And when Pastor Bob laughs, it seems just like Elvis. So personally, I can't rule it out. And if Elvis Presley was able to fake his death and fade off into the shadows with the assistance of Intel, then how many other artists might have done this through the decades? Is that what we were looking at with Tupac, for example? Could that be what we were looking at with Jim Morrison, who I know you want to talk about? And how many other artists who we're told died at an untimely age could this dynamic also apply to? We have to consider the question, I feel.
Regardless if Bob Joyce is really Elvis or not, has definitely brought him a lot of attention. He's definitely got his church recognized. I mean, he's blown up on TikTok. Some of those TikTok videos have millions and millions of views. People claim now he's come out publicly and said that he's not Elvis, but you know, I don't know how much weight that really holds. I mean, if you're actually trying to hide, of course you would say that you're not Elvis, right?
Well, he kind of has to. But you always find that they offer you symbolic clues, cryptic clues. So within Freemasonry, there's this dynamic known as masterful speaking, which is where you say two things at the same time. So there's a surface narrative that comes with plausible deniability. And that's what's put out there for the exoteric masses. So a good example of that comes from Paul McCartney, if it's really him. We can call him Billy Shears, if you like, William Shepherd, because there's this very strong opinion that the original biological Paul McCartney of the Beatles actually died in 1966. 11th of September is the date that most often comes up for this, 9/11/66. And that the public role of Paul McCartney has been getting played by an individual by the name of William Shepherd, known colloquially as Billy Shears, hence why on the Sgt. Pepper album we get the lyric early on, "May I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears," because that was supposed to be the public's initiation to the new version of the Beatles with this guy in place of the original Paul. So over the years, this idea, this conspiracy theory, keeps bubbling to the surface every now and again. And every so often, Paul or Billy, whoever he is, gets asked about it. So in 2009, he went on the David Letterman chat show, and Letterman directly addressed all these silly, crazy rumours that Paul McCartney is really dead. And, you know, Paul is laughing along with it, and he's saying, yeah, what happened was there was a sleeve to this record called Abbey Road, and I was walking across the zebra crossing barefoot. Because I was barefoot, everyone was looking at it and going, he's dead. And then Letterman has a good old laugh about it. And then he said, oh, of course, the other part of it is that you were replaced by this guy that, took the place of the original Paul. And McCartney or Billy, whoever it is, has a good old laugh. And he goes, yeah, well, I'm him. So right there, he's told you that he's the replacement. He's told you that he's not the original Paul, but it comes with plausible deniability. So the audience has a good old chuckle because they're like, oh, what a ridiculous idea. But he's told you. Now, if he's questioned and pinned down about it, he can say, oh, I was joking. Come on, you can't take me seriously, surely. But for those in the know, those who are initiated into occult systems and secret societies and learn how to spot symbolism and spot cryptic speech, he's told you something else. He's told you that he's not that original guy. So that's masterful speaking, and Masons learn how to do this, say two things at the same time, and they're seemingly contradictory, but the cover story, which is put out to the masses, is what they want most people to believe. So you have to learn to read the language of symbolism and code and cryptic ways of speaking to get to the bottom of what they're often telling you.
Neuro-linguistic programming at its finest. Our third movie was going to be about the Beatles. So we were planning on doing, the first one was JFK-X, about the JFK assassination, the next one about The Shining, and then the third one was going to be about the Beatles, but it kind of fell apart and fell through. But we talk a lot about the music industry. Well, you talk a lot about the music industry in A Clockwork Shining. And there was a lot of things that you have said about Jim Morrison and the Doors and how his dad was a high up naval officer responsible for the Gulf of Tonkin false flag event, which led to the Vietnam War, which was responsible for hundreds and thousands of deaths. And it makes a lot of sense because Jim Morrison seemed like he could kind of do whatever he wanted to do because he knew that he was always going to kind of, get out of it because his dad was this high-ranking naval officer. Now, you mentioned in the movie A Clockwork Shining that you believe that Jim Morrison had faked his death. Do you have any more information on that? What led you to that conclusion?
He ticks all the boxes for being the ideal candidate to have faked his death because of the family connections that he had. His dad was very high-ranking, as you just mentioned, a Navy admiral. And 1 year prior to Jim breaking through as the frontman of the Doors, he appeared in a commercial in 1964 for Florida State University, which you can get from YouTube. So he's there in his college blazer, he's got closely cropped hair, and he's playing the role of a student from this Florida university. And he's very serious, very scholarly. And then 1 year later, he's grown out his hair, he's up there on stage with all these songs that have appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He's got all his bandmates with him, and all his bandmates in the Doors have high-ranking military fathers, all of them. Some of them, like Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek, are more high-level connected than Jim himself, you can see. So the Doors were effectively a military band. So by 1965, he's up there on stage, he's making drunk performances, he's pushing drug culture, he's very much embodying the anti-establishment, countercultural, youthful spirit of the times. And the Doors were one of the bands that were used the most to push all that stuff forward. So the social engineers wanted to change the culture of the times, and it involved pitting the young people, the baby boomers, that was the generation that was in their crosshairs, against their parents' generation and value systems. So it's just more sowing discord in society and setting one group or one generation off against another. So it was sex, drugs, rock and roll, all kinds of other social changes and turmoil and unrest. There were all these activist groups going on, the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground and all these activist groups. There was Gloria Steinem coming out with Ms. magazine and pushing the contraceptive birth control pill and trying to supposedly empower women by getting them to embrace feminism, the modern feminist movement. All these major social changes, not to mention Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and all this other stuff that was going on. So by the time you get to 1969, American society, and therefore by default world society, because everywhere else gets affected by it, was unrecognizable from what it had been at the start of that decade. Everything had changed. Attitudes to everything had changed. The Vietnam War was in full throttle, and as we've said, that was significantly accelerated by the role of Jim Morrison's father. And just everything in culture was different. Bands like the Doors had played a major role in shifting things in that direction. And by 1971, it seems that Jim Morrison's role was pretty much done because they got the social changes that they wanted. And a lot of the bands that had come out of Laurel Canyon, the Doors and all their contemporaries, weren't really needed anymore. There were new styles of music coming through, and that continued as the 1970s progressed, got into sort of punk and new wave by the latter part of the decade. And it seems that Jim's role, if we accept he was an actor, and I do, he was literally an actor, just like Tupac, was no longer needed. So what do you do with somebody that comes from a military family when they're not required anymore and they're only 27, part of this mythical 27 club, a large number of musicians that have died at the age of 27 in some strange circumstance or other. Well, if you're high-level military grade connected, like Jim was, you're going to know the right people to enable you to fade off into the background and fake your death. And that's what I believe happened. So the date we were given for his death was the 3rd of July, 1971. Interestingly, this was 2 years to the day after the founding member of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones, himself died, 3rd of July 1969, when he was found floating face down in the swimming pool of his country cottage in southern England. So I personally feel that Brian Jones was taken out. It was all to do with the other Rolling Stones wanting to take control of the group, steer it off in certain desired directions, and Brian was seen as getting in the way. He was expendable, past his sell-by date, and he went. Also, 3rd of July is when David Bowie retired his Ziggy Stardust character. Live on stage at Hammersmith Odeon in London, he announced that Ziggy Stardust was going to be retired off, which horrified all these die-hard Bowie and Stardust fans. So there's something about the 3rd of July. It is the feast of St. Thomas within sort of occult circles, and I wonder if that's why that particular date was chosen. So we're told that old Jimbo turned up dead in the bathtub of his Paris apartment that he shared with his girlfriend, common law wife Pamela Corson. So he was found unconscious in the bathtub, but there was no autopsy done on his body. And the only people to have seen his body prior to it being taken care of were Pamela, his partner, and one other guy, medical guy. And it's reported that Jim had a smile etched onto his face, which is a pretty strange thing and a bit difficult to achieve for a dead body. And the fact that there was no autopsy performed has got to raise some questions. So nobody can actually tell you what Jim Morrison died of, if you accept that he died. People have got this vague idea that it was some sort of overdose, but nobody really knows what the drug might have been. And we get this so often with rock star deaths. They're just chalked up as some sort of overdose or possibly, suicide, or nobody really worries too much about what it was that caused this person to pass away, because it's just chalked up as the rock and roll lifestyle. That's the way these people live fast, die young, all kinds of drugs and alcohol abuse and all this sort of stuff. I've often said, if the same amount of plumbers or lorry drivers turned up dead as rock stars do, people would be saying, what's going on? Why are all these plumbers and lorry drivers dying? What's happening, man? But when it comes to rock stars, they can just get away with it. So they achieved that with Jim, and he went into sort of mythical rock god status, like so many of these 27 Club members and people like James Dean that just entered into legend. And you've got all these die-hard Doors fans that just feel Jim was this prophet and this poster child for the anti-war sort of countercultural generation. And a lot of people just don't seem to consider his military connections and what that might have enabled him to do. So his wife, Pamela Corson, died just a few years after him. And we also have the strange case of Jimi Hendrix, who died in September 1970. He was also 27 years of age. And there was this big spate at the time of all these artists that were passing away unexpectedly. Brian Jones, there was Jimi Hendrix in September 1970. The following month, October 70, Janis Joplin. Then in July 71, it was Jim Morrison. And they were all 27. And with Jimi Hendrix, there's so much evidence to demonstrate that he was murdered. He was taken out at the hands of his manager, a guy named Michael Jeffrey, who was actually a British military intelligence insider. That was actually his job. And for some reason, he pops up as Jimi Hendrix's manager. He managed some other groups as well, including the Animals of Newcastle, who became one of the bands in Laurel Canyon when they relocated from England. So Jimi Hendrix, it seems, actually died through being waterboarded with red wine. This is what the coroner, who examined his body, because there was an autopsy there, said. He said that he was saturated in red wine. And when he pressed down on his chest, it was all coming up through his windpipe and stuff. So it seems that Michael Jeffrey had hired a couple of thugs from the Newcastle underworld to come down to London to do the job, to finish Jimi Hendrix off. We're told that it was to do with music publishing, the old adage that an artist is worth more to a corporation dead than alive. But there's a lady named Rachel Caruso who did a video a while back claiming she comes from a multi-generational MK Ultra satanic ritual abuse family, and that she had an uncle named Paul Caruso who was Jimi Hendrix's handler, mind control handler. And she repeats this idea that Hendrix was got rid of in this way. And she says it's because Jimi Hendrix was starting to break his mind control programming. So he also was an MK Ultra slave, she says, from a multi-generational family on his mother's side. And when he was starting to regain some of his memories and his innate humanity was starting to bleed through the MK programming, it was decided that he was becoming too much of a liability. So that's why he had to go. That's her account for why he was got rid of. So I think Jimi Hendrix was a genuine offing, but Jim Morrison, I don't accept it was, because of all the unanswered questions that we have hanging over it, and mainly because of how high-level connected he was, who his father was, the fact that he'd done acting jobs before. So it raises the tantalising possibility that Jim could still be alive. If he is, he'll be 80 years of age, but it's not impossible. Stranger things have happened, it turns out.
80 isn't that old. 80 is not that old. He could possibly still be alive if he did indeed fake his death. And I think that this is interesting what you just said about the music industry. Like, they're worth more to them dead than they are alive, because then they no longer have to pay them for their money. So then they can just have, don't have to pay them for their music, so they can just keep all the money. It's kind of like what people have talked about with Prince. And the reason that they offed Prince is because Prince, this is a theory and speculation. The reason that they offed Prince was because he got the rights back to all of his music, and he wasn't distributing it to any of these platforms. He wasn't giving it, he took it all off of Spotify, he took it all off of Apple Music and all that. And 2 years after he got the rights back to all of his music, he was offed.
Right.
They don't want you to have the rights to your music, because if you have the royalties, and that's the same way with Michael Jackson as well. Michael Jackson had a huge catalog of music that he owned. He owned all of the Beatles.
Right.
Like huge catalogs of music. So it makes sense that they would want to, get rid of these people, because then that opens up all the royalties and all the music that they have access to.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. When Whitney Houston turned up dead in a bathtub, and that was very strange as well in 2012, because 24 hours before Whitney was found dead in a bathtub, her daughter that she had with Bobby Brown, Bobby Christina, was also discovered unresponsive, unconscious in a bathtub in the same hotel suite, the LA Beverly Hilton. So this raises the possibility that Bobby Christina was the one that was supposed to be taken out, and for whatever reason, that didn't happen. So then 24 hours later, Whitney is discovered dead in the bathtub. And this was at the time when Clive Davis, who's a very suspect guy, music industry executive, he's been around forever. He was head of Arista Records. He put Puffy on the map, P. Diddy. So go figure. He's the guy that basically gave him his career and facilitated Bad Boy Records. But he was Whitney Houston's mentor. He's said to have discovered her and signed her to Arista. And at the time, Whitney was getting honoured at a party for the Grammys, because the Grammys were taking place in LA at that time. And the news filtered through that Whitney had been discovered dead in the hotel hotel suite above where they were having this party. And instead of stopping the party, which is what you might imagine would get done in the interest of good taste, Clive Davis decided to turn it into a celebration. So he said, no, we're not stopping the party, we'll just do it to honour Whitney. So the event is said to have taken on a sort of celebratory vibe. So when you get into the dark occult aspects of what goes on in the music industry and entertainment generally, you get into things like rituals and the idea of sacrifices, the idea of artists being taken out, the idea of family members of artists being taken out as a condition of their fame and success and prominence and wealth. There's a heavy price to pay for being famous in these fields if you don't come from one of these important bloodline families. So it's possible that Whitney Houston was taken out in that manner to fulfill some kind of sick, ritualistic agenda that these controllers adhere to. So, where was I going with this? I was making a point about Whitney Houston. Yeah, she died in February, and this was just a couple of days before Valentine's Day. And when you think about the vast bulk of Whitney Houston's music, what it covers lyrically, is love songs. So it was reported at the time, in 2012, that her back catalogue, sales of her old albums, absolutely skyrocketed, went through the roof. All these fans were going out to buy these albums in tribute to her. And every Valentine's Day now, people are going to be flocking out and buying Whitney Houston albums because it's love songs, right? So the timing is often important as to when these artists are taken out. And it is publishing in so many instances. You mentioned Prince and Michael Jackson, so many parallels between those two artists. You know, they were both doing battle with their respective record labels, Warner Brothers, the Sony Corporation. They both called them out as being completely immoral and exploiting artists and the terrible nature of the contracts that they were held in. They were trying to regain control of their own music publishing, back catalogues, master tapes. Another artist that was embarking on that route was George Michael. So he did battle with Sony as well. He was signed to the same corporation as Michael Jackson. And it didn't end well for any of them. And there's all kinds of other strange stuff as well, like Michael Jackson, we're told, died on the 25th of June 2009, which is George Michael's birthday. George Michael died 6 months later to the day, on Christmas Day of 2016, 10 years to the day after James Brown. James Brown is also said to have attempted to extricate himself from his record deal way back in the 1960s, when he, Sam Cooke and Otis Redding formed this sort of coalition where they were planning to launch their own record label for black soul artists and take back some of their power from the corporations that they were signed to, and, you know, win back their publishing and things of this nature. So straight away, Sam Cooke seemingly got taken out. We're told that he tried to rape a young woman at a motel after a show, and the woman escaped from his room and panicked and went to the motel reception, and the receptionist grabbed a gun and shot Sam Cooke as he tried to break into the office. That's what we're told. But as with all things, there's all sorts of anomalies and discrepancies and problems with the official story there. But either way, in December 1964, Sam Cooke was out of the picture. Then in 1967, also December, Otis Redding boarded a light aircraft after a show, and it crashed into a lake, killing everyone on board, including the barcades, Saltwood, that were travelling with him. So everyone was ready. So that just left James Brown in a single misfire for having dared to go up against his paymasters, his owners, was to be forced into loyal, obedient service to the control system for several decades to come. So for the next 40 years, he became known as the hardest working man in show business because of the amount of albums he put out, the amount of shows he did. Was that through personal choice, or was he being forced to do this because that was his payback? I suspect it was the latter. And then, even when he did die, in his 70s on Christmas Day of 2016. There are, would you believe it, anomalies and discrepancies surrounding that event as well. Very strange stuff. So the 25th of June, when Michael Jackson died, is known within satanic groups as anti-Christmas. So whereas the rest of us celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December, because it's marking the sun having reached its lowest point in the solar year in its annual journey. So the winter solstice has occurred, 21st of December, and then the sun is seen to effectively stay still, which is what the word solstice means, for the following 3 days. And then on the morning of the 25th of December, it very slowly, very gradually begins to rise again. So it's God's sun, S-U-N, not S-O-N, rising after 3 days in the tomb, 3 days of being dead. Does that remind you of any stories you might have heard? So that's what Christmas is all about. It's the celebration, at least in the what's referred to as the Northern Hemisphere, of the days starting to get slowly longer as the sun moves towards its high point at the summer solstice. So Satanists who twist and invert everything celebrate the opposite. So on the 25th of June, 3 days after the summer solstice, the sun is gradually, very slowly declining a little every day. So it's symbolically being seen to die. And that's what Satanists love. They're all about death and decay, and symbolically they like to represent this. So it's interesting that that's the date when Michael Jackson passed away. It's George Michael's birthday, and it's 6 months to the day before George Michael turns up dead. George Michael, a man arguably best known for the lyric, "Last Christmas I gave you my heart," turns up dead on Christmas Day of heart failure. You couldn't make it up, and you don't have to.
That's a wild coincidence. Wild coincidence, Mark. There's a lot of information about Michael Jackson, and I think that Michael Jackson, there was this video that I watched, which I don't know if it's true or not, but someone analyzed the license plate number on the van that carried Michael Jackson's body out, and it shows him, they're pulling into a, have you seen this video? Where they're pulling into a parking garage and Michael Jackson gets out of the back of the van?
I think I've heard about it, but I've not seen the video.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And then later on, that same van with the same license plate is seen on the news, like picking up Michael Jackson's dead body.
It's just crazy, man. It's crazy. Every time you get a reported artist death, there's all kinds of things to just completely mess with your mind and tie researchers like me up and send us on down the path. You know, you have to be very thorough with your research not to get caught up in some kind of psyop in such cases, you know. So with David Bowie, for example, so 2016 was a really unlucky year in music history. So we're told that in January the 10th, David Bowie sadly passed away of cancer at the age of 69. At the very end of the year, Christmas Day, George Michael turns up dead in bed on Christmas Day. And you had the death of Prince in the middle, 21st of April 2016, we're told, at the age of 57 in an elevator at his Paisley Park complex just outside Minneapolis. So Bowie was a couple of days away from his birthday when he sadly passed away from cancer. This is an interesting thing because I've noticed a lot of celebrities, famous people that die seem to die 2 days before their birthday. I only noticed this today, but Jimmy Savile, I'm sure everyone knows all about Jimmy Savile and what he was up to, died 2 days shy of his 85th birthday in 2011. So he's born on Halloween, couldn't make that up, 31st of October, and he dies on the 29th. And I think, I've got to check this out, but David Lynch has just passed away, and I think he was 2 days shy of his birthday as well. So it's interesting how many of these famous people don't quite make that birthday by 2 days. But anyway, that's by the by. So David Bowie, we're told, dies in January 2016. So the morning after the news breaks, Sky News have this bulletin, and they wheel out this guy to pay tribute to the life of David Bowie. And they say that he's a music industry executive who goes by the name of Jack Stephen. Nobody had heard of Jack Stephen up to this point. When you went to do a background check on him at the time in 2016, as I and many others did, there was virtually nothing to be found of him online. Since then, I've discovered a few things. So he's got a LinkedIn profile. There's a mention of him in a Eurythmics book as having effectively discovered the Eurythmics or signed them to RCA Records. So he now seems to have a bit of a history in the music game. But in 2016, I was wondering who he was. So he appears on this Sky News interview, and immediately people started remarking on how much he looked like David Bowie. And not only that, but he sounded just like him as well. The voice was uncannily similar, a bit like Pastor Bob Joyce and Elvis. So now you're left wondering, is this Bowie? Is he mocking us? Is he appearing one last time and then he's going to fade off into obscurity like Elvis possibly did? Or are we getting a bit too paranoid and a bit too conspiratorial, and has the guy really died and we're just reading too much into this? But then you look at the situation surrounding Michael Jackson. And the morning after we got the news of Michael Jackson in 2009, Larry King on CNN interviews this guy whose name is given as Dave. I think his real name is supposed to have been David Rothenberg.
The supposed burn victim.
Right. So the story is that when he was a kid, this guy was set on fire by his abusive father, and he suffered terrible burns, had to undergo surgery and such. And Michael Jackson befriended him in hospital. So when Michael died, Dave appeared to say what a wonderful guy he was and to share his memories of him and stuff like that. But again, people remarked at the time on how it looked as if it could be Michael Jackson under heavy prosthetic makeup, and how similar his voice was to Michael's. It sounded just like Michael. So it leaves guys like me unsure of exactly what's gone on and unable to say 100% one way or the other if these people are completely departed stars.
Oh my gosh, one more dragon.
Or whether it's just coincidence or just the way things go. It's very difficult to pin down
Honestly,
exactly what's gone on here. And I think they knew it deliberately to the likes of us.
Well, there's also this video that I've most recently seen of Paul McCartney here, where the guy behind him looks more like he would probably look than he actually looks. It's so interesting. This video of Paul McCartney, and right behind him, this guy is going to appear that looks more like. Oh, right there he is.
It looks like friggin' John Lennon, doesn't it?
It does. Oh my God, yeah, it does. Look at him.
Yeah. So people are saying, wow, that actually looks like John Lennon. It does look a bit like John Lennon.
Oh, I thought it was like the reincarnation of Paul McCartney, but it does look like John Lennon, yeah.
Yeah, and when he turns to the side, he's got Lennon's nose, his kind of pointed nose. But there's all kinds of problems there as well, because we now have AI fakery, and you can't trust a video anymore because it could have been digitally manipulated and AI could have been put in there. You can't trust a picture that you find online anymore because it could have been photoshopped, because the fakery is now very good. So it's very difficult to be able to place any stock in any of this stuff. Really, you've got to go back to print photographs, which are much more difficult to fake, and old magazines and old books that have been around for decades, if you want any reliable evidence in any of these cases. Most other things become grey areas because of their capacity for fakery. I mean, even something that troubles me greatly is I'm totally open to the idea that Paul McCartney was replaced, and the guy we have today might not be the original Paul McCartney. I can certainly say there's been more than one Paul McCartney. It's obvious from looking at photos and film footage and stuff. He changes in height, he changes in appearance, his face gets fatter and then longer and thinner. So it's two separate guys, or possibly more than two. But something that bothers me greatly is that I'm a big John Lennon fan. I love his solo music. I loved a lot of the stuff that he put out in the Beatles. I know that he was a very compromised character, a very complex character, and in many cases, he was not a particularly likable character. You know, he was very unkind to his first wife, Cynthia, to his son, Julian, reportedly. He used to mock disabled people and stuff, and these aren't great traits, you know. But at the same time, he put out some incredibly empowering music through his solo canon of work in the 1970s. And I personally believe that he was very sincere, very conscientious in a lot of the messages that he was putting out there. And you don't really find any other artist in music history that's put out that many profound songs in terms of spiritual, mystical stuff, which you've got in a lot of his songs, and also the more politically, socially conscious songs, and songs that just address complex topics and interesting subjects that other artists don't really go near. So, for all those reasons, I really like John Lennon's work. He's a totally fascinating character to study. But what bothers me is that when you look at the time of his final album, Double Fantasy, which was released just a few weeks before we're told he was shot outside the Dakota building in December 1980, he doesn't quite look the same as the John Lennon of old. He's changed in some ways.
But is that because he kind of got out of the whole, music industry, and he was, sort of became a hippie as well? But could that have been because he didn't have all the people around him, he didn't have the makeup going on, so he aged more, so he looked different? Because I think that's a contention with a lot of this stuff too, because some people are like, oh, the celebrities look completely different. I'm like, well, if you're kind of out of the spotlight, you're not getting all of the work done that you would normally be getting done. You would be made to look like you're younger than what you are. Like, I guarantee if Tom Cruise didn't have as much work done on him, if Brad Pitt didn't have all that work done on him, they would look like their age that they're supposed to be.
Right. Yeah, well, I take that point, but it was more in facial structure and, facial features that I started to see some problems. But the thing with John Lennon and all the Beatles is just how much they did change their appearance. And not only that, but they appeared to be two separate groups. They had two very distinct phases. So when they first emerged with their debut single, 1962, Love Me Do, they just finalised their original lineup, or the lineup that people are familiar with. So Stuart Sutcliffe was the original bassist, and he, at the ripe old age of 21, for brain aneurysm, right before the Beatles broke through the prominence in 1962. Pete Best, whose mother, Mona Best, got the Beatles their very earliest gigs in Liverpool. She came from a military family background, would you believe? Her son Pete was the original drummer in the Beatles. And Mona Best, Pete's mother, got impregnated by a close friend of the Beatles, a guy by the name of Neil Aspinall. So he was a young guy, he was the same age as the Beatles, but he got Pete Best's mother knocked up, and she ended up giving birth to a son who was named Rogue Best, Vincent, or Rogue Best. And instead of getting rid of Neil Aspinall, who was a sort of roadie and an assistant and a close confidant of the Beatles, you might think this would be a very embarrassing affair and they'd want to get rid of Neil, to deflect attention away from what had happened. But no, they didn't do that. They kicked Pete Best out of the group and they replaced him with Ringo. So Ringo became the drummer with the Beatles, and he's the one that went on to the fame and the fortune and the great wealth. Whereas Pete remained in Liverpool and has just opened up the Casbah Coffee Club, which is where the Beatles did their first gigs in the city, as an Airbnb, because it's been his home for several decades. So the Beatles came out with this lineup, and to start with, they were doing these songs that endeared them to a certain demographic. So girls loved them, but they were also family friendly. So it's She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, from me to you, songs like this. And there were songs that your mother would like and your granny would like. So it's inoffensive. They did the Ed Sullivan thing in New York in February '64 and, endeared themselves to American audiences. But then 1966 comes along, and this is the beginnings of the counterculture. This is the beginnings of the flower power sort of hippie era and all these big social changes. And by the following year, which was known as the Summer of Love, 1967, they released the Sgt. Pepper album, which is very trippy and very psychedelic in parts. And they look like a completely different band. So those who adhere to the theory that Paul McCartney was replaced will say that by the time of Sgt. Pepper, they've switched out Paul for Billy Shears. So you're looking at a different guy. But they've all changed appearance. So on the cover of that album, they got longer hair, they're wearing moustaches, and then over the ensuing years, sometimes they got beards, sometimes they haven't. Sometimes they're wearing moustaches, sometimes they're not. John Lennon's got his little granny glasses sometimes, and sometimes he hasn't. Sometimes he's got long hair, and then he gets his hair cropped off. So they're looking different all the time. And I wonder if this was done deliberately to throw people off the scent if certain members have been getting replaced. Because it could just be explained away as, oh, the Beatles were just going with the fashion of the times, and, of course they look different from album to album, because everybody did in those times. There's a theory that the Beatles were the product of British military intelligence. Military intelligence is, of course, an oxymoron. But MI5 and MI6 are very closely linked to the Tavistock Institute, which is a social engineering think tank where psychological operations are dreamt up by social scientists, behavioral scientists, psychologists, those who want to change culture and change societal attitudes to all kinds of things. So they weaponize popular culture to get the job done. So they do it through things like movies, TV shows, and of course music groups. So there was this guy named John Coleman, Dr. Jonathan Coleman, who was a British military intelligence guy, and he broke ranks and became something of a whistleblower, and he put out a book which was published in 1991 titled The Committee of 300, Conspirators' Hierarchy. And this is a very sort of key book within conspiracy circles. He breaks down the 13 so-called Illuminati families, and he talks about secret society networks and the way they're all structured. But he makes a very bold claim in that book that the Beatles, and not just the Beatles, but also the Rolling Stones, who were supposed to be the Beatles' rivals, but supposedly came out of the same camp, were the product of Tavistock. And they were made as popular and as influential as they became, because you don't get those levels of fame and influence under your own steam. You have to be selected for it. There's no way a group could get even a fraction of the way towards the influence that the Beatles had over so many people if they didn't have the backing of the state, the military-industrial complex, the true controllers of organised society. So, of course, the Beatles have to have been chosen, hand-picked, to be that group. And so that's apparently what they were doing. They were changing societal attitudes by sweeping their fan base along with them. So they started out as this group putting out these love songs, boy meets girl love songs. And then by the latter part of their career, they've embraced psychedelic, acid culture, and all the changes that were coming out of California in those times were being echoed in the London underground, the sort of counterculture that was happening in London at the time, with the Beatles spearheading the whole thing. So, it's interesting, isn't it? Because LSD appeared everywhere at the same time in Britain and America. And yet we're supposed to believe it's just this organic thing. It's just the way these cycles of culture go. And acts in America, bands were getting all psychedelic and experimenting with these new trippy sort of sounds at exactly the same time as groups like the Beatles and Pink Floyd and The Who were over here in Britain. It all smacks of being orchestrated social engineering, dreamt up, cooked up at Tavistock, because that's where they all come out of. And with groups like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Doors, the Mamas and the Papas, Frank Zappa, the Mothers of Invention, Joni Mitchell, all these other groups, the Beach Boys, the Monkees, Alice Cooper, all these bands that were coming out of Laurel Canyon, being used as assets to get the culture of the time changed. And I think it's fairly safe to say, fairly accurate to say, that the ripples from what went on in the 1960s at the hands of these kinds of groups and those that control them are still being felt in society today. So a favourite thing that my dad used to say to me, there'd be this kind of situation where when I was younger, we'd be watching a movie together. I'd be like a teenager and a sex scene would come on. And there's nothing more awkward than watching a sex scene in a movie with your parents in the room. You start to shuffle awkwardly in your seat, you know. And my dad would usually break the silence by saying, "I blame the 60s for this." And he had a point, because that's when it all began, you know, sex coming into films and depictions of violence. It all happened at that time. In 1969, 20th of March, right at the time of the spring equinox, there was a guy named Dr. Richard Day, and he held a meeting which was connected to Planned Parenthood. So this is the eugenics operation that Bill Gates' father was a founder member of, all about population reduction. What could possibly go wrong, right? And Richard Day addressed a group of paediatricians as part of Planned Parenthood. And he outlined all the changes that were scheduled to take place in society in the decades ahead. And he told the people in the audience, David Icke tells this story often, but it's come up in my research as well. He told all the attendees to not take notes and to turn off their recording, tape recorders. And one doctor there, for whatever reason, did take notes. And years later, just before he passed away, he published what he could remember of that meeting in 1969. And he said, Richard Day told everyone that music was going to get worse. Music was going to be used deliberately to drive a wedge between young people and their parents' generation. They were going to degrade moral values. They were going to deliberately and systematically work with Hollywood, the television industry, to get graphic depictions of sex and violence into movies and TV shows that would be seen by a mainstream audience. And it was a slow drip, subversive attack through popular culture on not just America, but the rest of the world. And I think we can conclude that they've done a brilliant job of it.
Seems to be super successful. I mean, if you just look at the types of music that people listen to nowadays, dude, it's like completely garbage. I can't even listen to it. I can't even, like, makes my ears bleed, dude.
Literally that. If I'm ever in a shop where they start playing what passes for hip hop now with all this auto-tune, you know, I just have to get out of that shop because it makes me feel almost physically unwell. It has that effect on me.
There's also been this weird transition from bands and musicians into, I think it happened in the like early 90s, like as we were coming out of the 80s into the 90s, we started getting away from bands. Like it started becoming about the solo artist, like the solo person, and they started trying to rip people away from bands, like the singers of bands, and having them go out on their own. And like Fleetwood Mac, like a lot of these, they're trying to influence them, they're trying to break away from the band. And the only thing that I can think of is, you know, it's difficult to control 5 or more people, because sometimes, you know, with bands, there's a lot of people inside of the band. It's much easier to control one person than it is to control multiple people and get them all on the same page. So they started putting emphasis on solo artists now, and now that's all popular mainstream music is. It's no longer bands anymore. It's now solo artists. But I think bands are starting to kind of make a tiny bit of a comeback.
Another thing is that you get all these artists collaborating with each other. And I'm thinking of the genre that's described as urban. It's nothing of the sort, you know, but so-called hip-hop, so-called R&B. So you have like the first artist name, and then you have a bunch of others separated by commas. And I know this unfortunately because my daughter listens to a lot of this stuff and I see all the names coming up on the screen. But it's like 4 or 5 different artists featured on the same track. And it's just a way of getting all these artists out there to these different fan bases and stuff. But it all sounds the same. It all sounds exactly the same. It's the same producers they're working with. Everything's changing in auto-tune. They all sound like gibbering
Okay,
robots.
finish the dragon.
Talking here about artists like Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley broke out nearly 70 years ago.
Finish the dragon denim jacket and the white denim jacket.
Why?
So this will be the pink dragon.
Their music was good because their songs stood up to scrutiny. Analysis is still interesting to consider.
It's like a 3x, 2x or something. Pretty big. It'll shrink a little. So,
I miss Cardi B. Cardi B was great. She had some amazing songs.
alright.
The lyrical
Well,
complexity
thank you
and
for
the
joining
themes that she was
me.
discussing, and, you know, she was amazing, man. Just like you say,
I will
those
keep you updated
the
on
best artists, you know. Even
when I
incredible
start dying all this
Lyrics,
stuff.
lyrics are
Okay,
just so
thank you.
stunning. Megan Thee Stallion,
Bye.
Megan
Let's
Thee
see if I can
Stallion.
shut this off.
Egos, oh, so good, so good. It's not gonna happen, is it?
No, I don't think so. And that's the issue, is because there's no soul